For the next several slides, I want to talk about what the Depression was like, living through the Depression, and especially concentrating on those worst years of the Depression, which more or less coincide with Hoover's presidency. We'll talk about FDR and the New Deal at some length a little bit later. But for now, as we think about the depths of the Depression, 1931, 1932, into 1933, I want to start by sharing a couple of examples, both of which occurred in 1932, the worst year of the Great Depression. This is when things really seemed to be bottoming out, and when there was very little assistance or aid being offered, especially from the federal government. And so in some ways the frustrations of the American people were reaching a peak. The first example I want to share is known as the Farmers Holiday Association, which was headed by a man named Milo Reno. And we look back and can think of Milo Reno as in some ways almost a harmless example of how bad things had gotten, or perhaps an expression of how desperate some people had become. But we can also think of Milo Reno as not exactly providing a roadmap for parts of the New Deal, but his thinking was actually very much in line with what FDR was thinking about parts of the New Deal. And we will see that when we talk about the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the so-called AAA, under the New Deal. For now, what you want to understand about the Farmers Holiday Association and Milo Reno is that Reno had identified the biggest problem confronting farmers during this time as too much supply of farm goods and agricultural products reaching the market compared with not enough demand. And so the product was just flooding the market, and the price of farm goods had dropped and dropped and dropped. And so what the Farmers Holiday Association did, first and foremost, was they declared a holiday. We're going to stop growing things. We're going to stop bringing things to market. Now, bear in mind, this is only a couple of hundred farmers who agreed to do this. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to work. I mean, if a few hundred farmers stop growing things, it's not going to solve farm prices. But beyond that, not only are they going to take some time off and stop producing their products, this organization set about to sabotage product that was on its way to market. And that's actually what you see in this picture here. Farm protesters attempting to block roads leading to the markets at Sioux City, Iowa. They wanted to reduce supplies to raise prices. Okay, so they're actually stopping people who are trying to get their goods to the marketplace. At its worst, this organization actually attacked people or trains or beings that were trying to get the product to market. They were known to dump over milk trucks in the streets, dump over egg trucks in the streets. And who knows, that might be what they're about to do in this picture. I don't know if this example is one of those specific cases. They also attacked and blew up a couple of trains bringing agricultural goods to market. Now again, in the big picture, these things are not going to be enough to uphold or prop up the prices. Blowing up even a train here or there, but dumping over a truck of milk or eggs, not going to solve their problems. So I think we may best think of Milo Reno as kind of a desperate symbol of how bad things had gotten, that they would actually think that this might help. Indicates that things had gotten pretty desperate. As a final note, though, the idea of reducing supply to prop up prices is going to be exactly the motivation behind the Agricultural Adjustment Act under FDR's New Deal. An even more famous example of how bad things have gotten by 1932 is known as the March of the Bonus Army. And so just to give you a little bit of background, the Bonus Army is actually an army of World War I veterans marching to Washington here in 1932. So what was the foundation of this protest or this march? Well, those veterans of World War I, when they had come back home at the end of the war, they found that there was essentially nothing offered for them in society to help them. Now, these days, there are all kinds of veterans organizations and places you can go and benefits afforded to veterans of our military. None of that was in place in 1919. And some people in the country, a growing number, and especially members of Congress, began to feel like this was a grave injustice, that these men have fought and served for our country, many of them, bearing scars and wounds, and some of them crippled or blinded and things of that nature. We should give something to them. And so these kind of measures had come up a couple of different times for discussion in Congress. And in 1924, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Act, which was going to give bonuses to those World War I veterans, essentially amounting to $1 a day for time served. So for some of these guys, you're looking at maybe $1,000. For most of them, it would have been even less than that. Well, this is a good thing. I think most people would have agreed that, this was a good and necessary measure. These World War I veterans deserve this. However, there's a catch. Those bonuses were not going to be paid immediately in 1924 or immediately after the act went into place. They were going to be paid out in 1945. And so, in a way, they were going to be held as kind of a retirement nest egg for these veterans. Now, the primary motivation for that was that the American government could not afford, in 1924, to simply pay bonuses, hundreds of dollars and perhaps thousands of dollars to every one of the millions of World War I veterans. The government needed the time to build up the capital that was going to be necessary to pay those out. And I think in 1924, most of the veterans understood that. It wasn't terribly problematic. After all, we are in the Roaring '20s, and actually we're just heading into the peak boom period of the 1920s. But what happens in 1929? And what's going on in 1930, 1931? The boom times are behind us. The stock market has crashed. The Depression is setting in. And many of these veterans who were doing okay in 1924, 1925, 26, now may find themselves unemployed, certainly struggling, some of them homeless. And so slowly at first, and then in growing numbers by the summer of 1932, thousands of these World War I veterans marched to Washington to make their plea to get those bonuses now. This is the Bonus Army, and as many as 40,000 veterans arrived in Washington in the summer of 1932. Most of them were settled in a place called Anacostia Flats, which you see in the picture on the lower left. This is across the river from Washington, D.C. itself. You can't really make it out, but in the background of that picture, there's a river between the camp and the city of Washington itself. Others of these veterans were in the city. They had found abandoned warehouses or buildings. They were camped out in the city. But most of them were in Anacostia Flats. And this came to be, in some ways, sort of the poster example of what were known as Hoovervilles, these little villages thrown together of shanties and lean-tos and tents and whatever else people could find that represented the poverty of the country, Hoovervilles. Hoover himself really didn't know how to handle this. He kind of was wringing his hands about the veterans. On the one hand, he was sympathetic to them. He wanted to see them helped. On the other hand, They were an eyesore to the nation's capital. Here is this army of homeless people camped out, and you've got foreign dignitaries and so on coming to visit the city, and this is what they see. So Hoover was getting frustrated with this. Kind of in the middle in this situation was the ranking general at the time, whose name was Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had served with many of these World War I veterans. He knew some of them personally, and he was kind of going out there and talking to the veterans and visiting with them and trying to reassure them that things were going to work out okay. On July 28th, Hoover decided that he had to resolve this situation, at least of the veterans who were living in the city itself. And so he ordered MacArthur to root out the veterans in the apartments and warehouses in the city and to get them out. Do not cross the river into Anacostia Flats, Hoover told MacArthur. Just handle the ones in the city. And so MacArthur, he's got his task. He rallies his forces, the actual army, and begins marching through the streets to get the bonus army out of the city. There's a period of confusion. The bonus marchers come out. I mean, they have come to trust MacArthur to some extent, and they hear, drums playing and trumpets sounding, and they hear all of this excitement, and they see the cavalry marching through the streets, and they think this is a parade in their honor. And so they come out, and it takes a little while for MacArthur to explain, oh no, this is no parade in your honor. I'm here to get you out of the city. And so there's clearly some misunderstanding and scuffling and pushing at the front of this line. And what you have now are the bonus veterans being driven out across the bridge over towards Anacostia Flats. Well, in the meantime, the bulk of the veterans in Anacostia Flats are hearing rumors that there's a parade going on in their honor, and so they start going the other way across the bridge into the city, where they now run right into the middle of this mess. The bonus marchers being pursued by MacArthur's troops and the army, and MacArthur is now incensed at all of this chaos and confusion. He feels like the bonus marchers have betrayed him. He was heard to say, there is incipient revolution in the air. And essentially he turned loose the army against the World War I veterans. MacArthur disobeyed Hoover's order not to cross the river, not to go into Anacostia Flats, and in fact did just that. Took the army across and destroyed the veterans' settlement there in Anacostia Flats. And so the veterans were pursued across the river through Anacostia Flats and essentially out of Washington, D.C., out into the countryside. 4 people were killed in this attack, including a couple of babies who died from tear gas, which was used in the attack against Anacostia Flats. Several people were bayoneted in the back. And the entire camp was destroyed. And you see a picture of that on the right, the destruction in the aftermath of this. Bear in mind, these are veterans of our military. These were World War I veterans now being attacked by the actual army itself. A young major named Dwight Eisenhower commented on the scene. The whole scene was pitiful. The veterans, whether or not they were mistaken in marching on Washington, were ragged, ill-fed, and felt themselves badly abused. To suddenly see the whole encampment going up in flames just added to the pity one had to feel for them. So this is how bad things have gotten. This is one of the worst moments in the worst year, in the worst depression of our nation's history. Our own army attacking its own veterans and driving them out of the city. These are the depths to which we have sunk in 1932. By 1932, the gross national product of the country had been split in half from its highs of 1929. The stock market, as we've discussed, was tanking. businesses were closing down, many of them having to shut down for good. Banks, many of whom finding their vaults empty, were also forced to close their doors. Unemployment, as we've discussed, reached 25%, and in parts of the country it could be much worse than that. Most people had no savings, had no insurance against the Depression at this point. Homelessness was reaching an all-time high, as many people could no longer afford to pay their rent or pay their mortgage. What happened if you got sick? There was no Blue Cross or Blue Shield at that time. There was no Social Security. There was no welfare or workman's compensation. Students were dropping out of universities, couldn't afford their tuition or housing or meals. People sometimes ask if people died because of the Great Depression. That's a difficult question to answer, but I think in simplest terms, yes, people died because of these kinds of things. It may be hard to pin down an exact statistic or number, but for your consideration, I would give you the statistic mentioned on the screen. In just one city, New York City, in 1 year, 1931, 95 people died of starvation. This is in the United States of America, not some third world country where people starve to death all the time. 95 people starving to death in New York City in 1931. So multiply that out times all of the many cities around the country and all of the many years of the Great Depression. So certainly hundreds of people dying of starvation, thousands of people dying, and many hundreds of thousands more on the brink of starvation, certainly suffering from malnutrition, suffering from hunger. As the country bottoms out in 1932, Bessie Smith, the great black singer of that era, put it in the words of her song, "Nobody knows you when you're down and out. Nobody gives a damn." And one of the great other songs of that period, or famous songs, went, "Brother, can you spare a dime?"